why I believe the NHS workers, all of them, deserve a pay rise. Obviously, this has been in the news quite a bit recently. Lots of our key workers, we are all aware, they've carried us through this pandemic. And I think the economic case for supporting all key workers is quite clear, but that seems to be lost on some members of the public and particularly the Tory party. So I'm really excited to be joined by some special guests tonight who've got first-hand experience of what life has been like working in the NHS through this pandemic, and my resident expert Bonnie Craven, who some of you will be more familiar with from other Socialist Telly episodes. So I'm delighted to be joined by Anthony Johnson, who is a registered nurse and he is involved with Nurses United as well, and Callum Bell, who is a psychiatric nurse in the North East, and he's also the Vice Chair of Momentum National Coordinating Group, so he's also been involved in campaigning. So Anthony, if I can come to you first. Obviously we've seen stories in the news about some of the kind of hardships that NHS workers have been through, and I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody. And I'm fully aware of the NHS it's not just nurses. We use nurses a lot and I'm appreciative of nurses, but it's not just nurses, It's everybody that contributes to the NHS. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are when you first heard this 1% pay rise thing come out from the Tory party. What were your thoughts?
I don't think it's surprising. I think that it's pretty disgusting that this is what this government's decided to do to us. I think that, no matter who we are, whether or not we're, a porter, if we're a frontline NHS worker, but I think a lot of key workers who exist throughout all the different professions and also this government, we all know that pay is directly linked to the safety of the NHS. I mean, 10 years ago, the NHS probably only had a couple of thousand vacancies within nursing. We now have 40,000, and across that same period, the average nurse's salary has fallen by a fifth. This is something that is affecting all key workers, though, throughout the NHS. It's not just nurses, as you quite rightly pointed out. And that's, I think, the thing that, I got involved in nursing because I wanted to make a difference. I got involved in nursing because I wanted to be able to care for people. And so the thing that's frustrating for me, most importantly, about this announcement is the fact that what essentially the government has done is decided to weaponize my patients' lives, but also the lives of my colleagues who are struggling with burnout, struggling with their mental health, because they want to essentially say that, we'll offer people a 1% as a bargaining chip to then try force down and run down the NHS and to put patient safety at risk. So that's the thing that's frustrated me, is it's disgusting. It's disgusting behaviour to treat people's lives like this, and it goes against every ideal of why I became a nurse and why people, I think, support the NHS.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, some people are imagining that they're doing it as a negotiating tactic, so come in low with 1% and then they will increase that slightly. But after everything that you've given over the last year, that's a pretty disgusting thing to do, isn't it, in a public way, to kind of hit people with, we don't value you, so we're going to give you 1%. Particularly, as you said, we're aware that the NHS has suffered real terms pay cuts over the last decade, and obviously staff have been massively impacted by those cuts. So it can't have gone down well. But I mean, can you just sort of explain, like, how do you think people are feeling now? And it's been so full on for the last year. Are people starting to feel that burnout? Because I imagine they must be. I don't know how you keep it going, to be honest.
I think, like, loads of colleagues were talking to me about this. I mean, Nurses United have done mental health surveys which showed that 8% of all NHS workers say they've had a deterioration in their mental health. We as well, unsurprisingly, a lot of us feel like we've been abused by the government, but also the public. But just in terms of like our personal experience, I've had loads of colleagues say, they went off sick during the middle of the two peaks with mental health issues, just for them to get back better, for them to then go back into the second peak of the pandemic. And it's just that wearing fatigue and that strain. And I'm sure people are feeling it all at home when they're stuck in lockdown, but it's for us as well, just constantly running around with a level of intensity beyond what the winter crisis is usually like. We've been the situation where we were in 2019. I think it's really important to remember, even before COVID-19, was we shut down all elective services. And now we're continually in that same state of anxiety, of stress, of burnout, of putting people through that pressure, but also a pressure where you're experiencing your hands go straight through gloves. where you're wearing bin bags, a pressure where you're basically feeling like your life is constantly at risk, and it's not worth anything. And then also then to be welcomed with the fact that the government's going to stand on their doorsteps and clap for you. I think that's the like emotional experience that people are going through at the moment. And it's no wonder then why a third of all nurses are saying that they're going to leave the profession. We've also seen that not just thinking about it, that's the third is people thinking about leaving the profession, but we've now, from our recent survey, seen 10% of all nurses saying that they're actively going, they're thinking of leaving. And I just think one thing I just wanted to add and just highlight is half of all nurses are over the age of 45. They can all take early retirement. So I think it's really we need to be mindful that, you know, the government can throw out 50,000 more nurses. That's 140,000 nurses who are over 45. So we're having an impending recruitment crisis for the NHS if this is what's the way we're going to treat people. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a really hard-hitting stuff. And I think that's a really important point to bear in mind. Even if they come up with a better offer now, they've got a lot of work to do to repair the damage that they've done by being so publicly ungrateful for the incredible service that everybody has committed themselves to through the last year, which frankly, they shouldn't have to have done. Like you said, with the shortages of PPE and things like that, some of the risks that people have been exposed to are beyond the call of duty. And I think that's something else that has really stood out for me, that it's all well and good to clap and to be grateful, but we should also recognise that people have been asked to do too much. There is a limit for what you should ask of people, and I do strongly believe that too much has been asked for people. And I can tell from the figures that you're citing there, that's a lot of research that you're aware of and really hard-hitting facts on the extent to which people have been impacted by this and the vulnerability the NHS is now exposed to. So Callum, if I can come to you for a moment. So obviously mental health is your profession. So you must be well aware of not just the impact on your profession, but the people that are coming into you, seeing the effects that the pandemic has had on everybody must be making life much harder now for you in your area of work. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely. So the pressure from a mental health perspective has been massively noticeable, particularly in younger people coming through into acute physical hospitals because of their mental health. And I think it's been incredibly draining being sort of on the front line and seeing the impact of this, because people have at the start of the pandemic, as Anthony touched on there, were maybe a little bit reluctant to get access to NHS services because that was the key message. And the problem is that's been built up over months and months and months. And with your mental health, if you're not seeking out access to support early as possible, then people do deteriorate. And we've seen a lot of that. And I think it's that combination of, I always describe mental health nursing as being sort of like an emotional sponge. You're there to sort of soak up a lot of other people's problems. When you've got that and you've got sort of the state that the NHS is in terms of reductions in services that we can now provide, in terms of the staffing numbers, which aren't as strong as they used to be. When you factor all that in and then having to work through a pandemic as well, it's a bit of a slap in the face when you hear 1%. And it's not, the money is massively important. Nurses don't live a luxurious lifestyle. I do question why I went into it at times, considering the pay that you're on when you first start. But like I said, it's about the value that the government put on NHS workers, and they clearly don't value us, given the fact that we're only willing to pay an extra £3.50 a week in terms of a pay rise. And you've got to consider as well the fact that Boris Johnson cared enough to call his son his middle name after the doctor at Tretton, but then won't be willing to give him enough to buy a meal deal. And it is just a bit of a slap in the face. And this 1% can't be seen in isolation. It's got to be seen on the background of over 10 years worth of a pay freeze, which had a significant impact on the wages that nurses and NHS workers are bringing home. And then, like I said, it's also the impact of working through austerity and the impact that's had on people's both physical health and mental health as well. And it's utterly draining. And it's the frustration of my colleagues and just that unwillingness of sort of, I guess, wanting to seeing a future of themselves in nursing and in healthcare. There's not a lot of colleagues that I work with who are as Anthony talked about before, at that age where they are thinking about retirement options. And again, why would you stick around? Certainly not for 1%.
No, it seems like we're at a really vulnerable point for the NHS as well. Then, if we, like Anthony just said, I was well aware of the impact of the austerity cuts in our hospital locally. We were seeing year-round Opal alerts. I think they call it Opal now, not black. Whatever difference that makes, I'm not sure. But it was ambulances queued outside for no particular reason. You know, they're just, these things would happen. It used to be an incredibly rare and quite scary thing, and then like 3 times in the same year, over not very much, because there's just no spare capacity left, was there? And that was before the pandemic. So when you've already had people working that hard for that long under so much pressure, to then add into that kind of extra insult, I just think it's so wrong. So what we need to do, like, I'm fully on board with wanting you to get this pay rise, obviously. I think the economic case is there. We want, you know, I don't want to be giving tax cuts to corporations or letting off companies like Amazon not pay their taxes and then thinking we can't afford to pay our key workers. But obviously not everybody out there is seeing that, although there's an unfortunate backlash from some of the media, let's say, reflecting on the unfairness, like why should we give nurses a pay rise and not our other key workers? So what would you, Anthony, what would you say to that if people out there are thinking nurses don't deserve it or shop workers should get more or something? What would you say to that?
I mean, I think the thing to be mindful though is this idea that as if we want to like get in an oppositional fight with the rest of key workers. Like we're nurses, like, you know, we believe in quite a lot of things being a health issue, and poor pay is one of them. And so we want to address those issues, whether or not they exist within the NHS or if they exist in somewhere like Morrison's. Like, you know, we want everyone to be able to have a fair wage, especially because what this government is full aware of is if you give a pay rise to NHS workers, when we spend money, we create jobs. So, you know, that's what we've been seeing with the issues around furlough is there's not been people spending the money. And that's why it's caused so much pressure on the private sector. So if they gave us the opportunity to go out there and spend, we would be going and doing that, because that's what we're going to have to do out of the necessity of being so poorly paid for so long. It'd be nice, hopefully, once we get out of this pandemic, if we could spend it on some nicer things. But yeah, it's going to be on essentials. But the reality is, though, it does affect patient safety. Like, it affects the way that you, your family, your friends are going to be able to experience your NHS. And we've all been feeling it. We've all been feeling waiting lists increasing. You know, we've been having situations where I was a health visitor, and the experience I had from working in somewhere like Leeds, which is where I'm based now, versus Tower Hamlets, where there was more deprivation and poverty there, was so different. Like, Tower Hamlets was like call the midwife. I'd go there, I'd be able to do my job properly. I could walk across it in 25 minutes and actually have conversations with people and actually do my job around health promotion. Up in Leeds, it was totally around like dealing with ill health, the fact that people have already gotten to a crisis point, the fact that there's domestic violence being caused by austerity. And so it meant that you weren't doing your job, because my caseload was 4 times the size of what it should be. And when I say 4 times the size, I mean something near like 1,000 when it should be about 250 children who I was working with, or families, should I say. And that's the thing, it has a material outcome at the end of the day if they decide to poorly pay us. And so that's what I think we should be arguing is, yeah, we want to have a pay rise for everyone because it's going to be good for this country. But also we want to have a pay rise for NHS workers because it's going to be good for patient safety.
It's a really strong point, Anthony, and I think a lot of people are missing that. They're just the impact that it's going to have on them when they come to need those services if we keep devaluing NHS staff like this. So Callum, what would you say? What message can we send out there to explain to people why it's important that we do value NHS staff and not get into this war about funding other key work positions?
I think firstly, we should be seeing pay rises across the economy for low-paid workers, because it's not only the right thing to do, but it's also a good economic strategy to reinvest into the economy. Because if you give working-class people a little bit more money in their pockets, it's going to get spent on the high street, which has been failing across the country. It's not going to get tucked away on a tax haven somewhere around the world. And I think this is a common strategy that the government are quite willing to use and have used throughout history, of this divide and rule. They'll turn each other in on each other and say, oh yeah, but what about him down the street? It's about, there's enough wealth within this country for people to not have to use food banks. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. And I think within the NHS and within NHS workers, we've also got to see the fact that this is sort of on the background of a massive pay freeze that's hugely undervalued the work that we do. People going about sort of nursing being a vocation and being a calling and things like that. Well, I came into nursing to make people's lives better and to make a difference. The reality is the job that I do is incredibly skilled. And if you look at other parts of my economy, the friends who I went to school with, who are either working as managers within supermarkets or estate agents, they're actually earning more than what I do. And not to devalue the work that they do, because they do a great job and they're a huge part of keeping the economy ticking over. But at the end of the day, the decisions I make, if I make a wrong one, people can die. And to walk away when I first qualified, it would have been 21 grand a year. And that was only 4 years ago I qualified. To make decisions around that, but to also then know I could go work in a call centre and earn a similar amount of money, it was sort of a bit frustrating. And again, that isn't the value of the work that we're doing. It's just an indication about how little the government value NHS workers. And at the end of the day, in terms of, like I said, turning us in on each other, this is exactly the tactic that we're going to use. Because whilst we're all talking about, well, why do I deserve a pay rise just as much as they deserve a pay rise, we're not talking about the fact that Dominic Cummings got a 40 grand pay rise, and there wasn't sort of a massive amount of backlash from that from the right-wing media as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's obviously contributing to the reason why so many people have left the profession, isn't that unending stress? But if you can get similar levels of wages or even better wages and have less emotional burden and less stress put on you, why wouldn't you? And we need to, rather than take advantage of the fact that people have such goodwill when they come into the profession and they want to make people's lives better, we should value that numerically as well as saying that we appreciate it. I believe so anyway. So Bonnie, you're an economist as well as an NHS campaigner. So what would you say then, if we're talking about how do we position this argument to encourage people to get behind pay rises for everybody, really?
Well, the impact and effect on the NHS over the last 40 years has been to deliberately, in my view, run it down and encourage people to take out private healthcare insurance where they can, thus opening up the market for all of those American insurance companies that want a piece of the NHS, which, as it was founded, was the most efficient and effective health service in the world. There is, as Callum mentioned, something called a multiplier, which means for every pound that the government spend directly on the NHS, it generates £1.70 for the economy, because people on lower wages spend their money, billionaires bank their money, and they don't even bank it here, they bank it offshore, so it's of no help. And £37 billion for a track and trace app that still hasn't delivered is a complete catastrophe. You know, that nurses, who are the people that are day in, day out saving lives throughout this crisis, should be faced with just a £3.50 a week rise is appalling. And that's not even going to come in very soon. But by the time that pay rise is landing in people's pay packets, inflation is going to have gone through the roof. So what we're looking at here is a real terms pay cut. That means for every pound that a nurse earns, they've got less money to spend on the economy. And another part of the issue is that a lot of nurses, I mean, most people in the general public are fully supportive of all of our public sector workers, particularly our NHS. Hardly any family has been untouched by the pandemic that's going on. So there's a lot of support for all of the nurses and all of our key workers. And I really don't think that we can afford to buy into this pitting one worker off against another worker. But what we're seeing, the very real impact, again, both of the guests today have touched on it, is an awful lot of nurses are having to sign up for overtime in order to make their pay packet pay their bills. And so they're signing on to nurse recruitment agencies, and obviously the agencies are creaming off a nice profit from that, taking money out of an NHS budget that should be being spent on NHS services, not shareholders' profits and baselines. And that means, more worryingly, that nurses are working more hours each shift than is safe really for them to do. It's not good for their health, it's not good for their mental health, and it's not good for patients who are relying on sharp, decisive and safe resolutions to their health issues that are going on. So, I mean, it really does need to be looked at. As I say, these attacks on the terms and conditions of people in the health service, and I will include on that mention to the junior doctors dispute that happened a couple of years ago. It's a systematic attack, breaking down the NHS, trying to make it seem unviable. It isn't unviable. It's the best in the world. Let's keep it that way. And it's about letting buildings run down. It's about making people distrust the people that are caring for them and giving everything they've got to their well-being. Again, so that people go out and take private healthcare insurance and brand the NHS as ineffective and dangerous. And we've got to stand up against that. It's a societal issue. The NHS is our proudest achievement. You know, it's hard fought for, and it will only last as long as we carry on fighting for it. And I genuinely believe that the general public are 100% behind every frontline worker that's put their lives on the line. At the end of the day, nobody who qualifies to teach, and bear in mind now, sorry, not teach, to practice in the NHS, bearing in mind now tuition fees, the removal of the bursary, the fast tracking of nurses training last year, because when we went into the crisis, there was already a massive shortage of nurses available to the NHS. So what they decided to do was take current nursing students and fast track them so that they could practice on wards and so on, because they were that desperately needed. We need to see a return of the nursing bursary. We need to start seeing nurses paid properly and being respected, as well as everyone in the NHS and everyone in the education sector too.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Bonnie. And I suppose the thing that we've got to make sure we remember from an economic perspective as well is we don't want to participate in this race to the bottom. There's no need to pit worker against worker. If we raise up nurses' wages, it helps us with the arguments for lifting up wages for other workers as well. We need to see actually wage levels rise in many sectors of the economy. There's barely anybody. There's just the rich few that've seen their wealth spiral, isn't it? And the rest of us have really struggled through austerity, and again, even more so through the pandemic. So I think that positive call for increasing NHS wages, as you've said, it has a massive impact. It's such a large employer. In places like where I live in Cornwall, it's the biggest employer in Cornwall. So that has a huge, huge impact on our local economy that's really struggled. So if we're wanting much better, obviously, than 1%, Anthony, what would you, I know you've been involved in some campaigning around increased pay rises for NHS workers for a while. What would your pitch be? How much should we be asking for now? What do you think would be appropriate?
I mean, for me, I think it's quite obvious that it has to be a restorative pay rise of 15%, because even that is still realistically going to be a real terms pay cut from 2010, but it's the kind of thing that will hopefully bring us back to safety within the NHS and hopefully be the thing that manages to stop a lot of those experienced health visitors, say, that would be in my team from leaving, but also tries to stop people from running away and leaving after they've unfortunately been treated quite poorly by this government during a global pandemic. So yeah, I'd go for 15%.
Okay, 15% for safety. And what would you say, Callum? Does that sound about right for your kind of experience?
Definitely. I think if you look at wanting to attract more people into nursing, because there is huge amounts of shortages within nursing and shortages across the NHS as a whole as well, we need a pay offer that's actually going to want people to come into the profession. Like I said, the hours are awful. The job, although it is lovely and fantastic at times, it can also be, as I said, that emotional sponge. It can be really draining. And I think it is about what value we put on health workers in the UK. And again, this isn't just within the NHS. If you look at health workers within the private sector in terms of care homes and things like that, they need pay rises as well, because the income they're bringing in is utterly shocking as well.
Okay, that's another really good point. Thank you, Callum. So I'm thinking if we go back to Bonnie's point about the systematic undermining of the NHS, which a cynical person would say it looks very much like they are doing, you know, with the changes that they've brought in, the way that the NHS is constituted to enable it to make it easier to sell off and things like that. It does look very much like they're trying to undermine it. And if we go back like 15 years before, actually it's even longer than that, isn't it? It's quite a bit longer than that, before the Labour government started upping the amount of money that was going to the NHS, prior to that, we'd seen constant stories in the news about people being left on trolleys and, the kind of undermining the NHS because the standards were so low. It was starting to build the argument for the NHS isn't fit for purpose. And a cynical person might think that they're actually deliberately doing that now because they want people to think, well, the NHS can't cope as it is, so maybe we do need to bring in private investment and that's somehow going to make it right. So I know we're all going to be against that, I'm quite sure. So how else, right, if you've got a wish list now, we obviously don't want privatisation in the NHS, but what other kind of positive demands would we be putting forward? What would make the NHS more successful for the future? So we want the bursaries, we want better pay and more staff, but there are other things that you're aware of that you think we should be campaigning for now to preserve the NHS and stop this undermining. If I can come to you first on that, Anthony.
I've got loads. I think that we should bring in safe staffing legislation that embeds ratios into it. I think that they should be applicable to all sectors, whether or not they're public or private. But I think that should be then tied to a recruitment and retention premium that is only available to the NHS, because you would be effectively forcing private services that won't be able to compete with the NHS to essentially give them back to the NHS. So I'd be doing things like that. I think that we should be going for an NHS New Deal. And I think that we should go for this concept of the freedom to be healthy, of the NHS essentially broadening its scope to include everything that we know as nurses affects people's health. Is, do you have access to a stable home? Do you have access to a stable environment? Do you have the ability to have free education? I think that what we need to do within the UK is have I think that I find frustration sometimes with NHS politics that we talk a lot about privatisation and not enough about propositionally what we want the world to look like. And I think that that's the thing that we should be doing, is building up a future of what being healthy means. And I think that, all of us as socialists, as NHS professionals, as health campaigners, have a role to play in that, in terms of fighting for that view and that world that we want to live in.
Thank you. That's a really interesting point. And I can see I get sucked into that, to be honest, as well. Like, I get really concerned with privatisation, but I am aware of those. The rest of my socialist politics is about making the world a better place. And we know the kind of impacts that has on health outcomes, but I don't think I'd position that strongly enough. So thank you for raising that. I think that's something we can all really try and take on board about how we argue going forward. Callum, what would you say? Have you got any kind of extra demands that you want to place there into the limelight now while we've got this moment?
No, I completely 100% agree with what Anthony just talked about there. I think the only thing I would add is around sort of bringing services back in-house with the NHS. I think the marketisation of service provision within the NHS has caused a lot of issues, not just in terms of what services are available to patients, but the direct impact that has on outcomes for patients and patients living a well and happy life as well. Because what happens when it goes out to these contracts go out to tender to provide essential services outside the NHS is they're looking to bid for something at the lowest possible marker, so that we can make the most amount of profit. And when that happens, service and patient well-being doesn't seem to be the number one driver in terms of delivering that service. And I think if you look at track and tracing, that's just a perfect example of where actually bringing things in-house within the NHS was not only a lot more efficient, it was also a lot better off in terms of patient care. And if you look across most and probably all services that are being provided by outside sources from the NHS, I can guarantee you that if it was brought back in-house, it would lead to better outcomes for patients.
Yeah, 100%. I'm pretty certain I've seen figures around that to do with like cleanliness in wards and outsourcing hospital cleaning services and things like that. And that I am aware of some of the terrible circumstances and really harsh working environments that have been created for people once they've been outsourced. We're devaluing people that we really need to be keeping us safe, and it's obviously not going to be good for outcomes. But it goes well beyond just pay. They cut equipment and things like that as well. Didn't provide sufficient equipment, just cutting corners right across the contract and making it impossible for the workers to be able to maintain the standards that they wanted to. So yeah, I mean, ending outsourcing has definitely got to be one of our top priorities. Bonnie, have you got any additional things you want to put on our wish list for the NHS tonight?
Oh boy, do I. I mean, I agree with both of the previous contributors, but I think the biggest single attack on our NHS was the Health and Social Care Bill of 2012. And inside that legislation, there was one tiny chink of light, one tiny ray of hope. And that was that any contracts that were to be issued out had to be bid for in a transparent process, and we had to have a look at what was going on. We couldn't see the value of them because that was company information, but there was a mechanism there to monitor who these contracts were going to be given to. And what we saw through this pandemic is, you know, billions going to Serco, billions going to Dido Harding and so on, without any scrutiny whatsoever. And the latest government legislation that they're pushing at the moment is to remove the requirement to put things out for tender. So basically what we'll see is the Secretary of State for Health handing out contracts, very lucrative contracts, to their mates. We've seen it through this pandemic. It doesn't have to be speculation. We know that this is what they'll do, and we have to absolutely stand against that. We need to be seeing, as Callum said, we need to be seeing the money that's spent on the NHS going to the NHS. It must be publicly provided, meaning that the professionals that work in the system every single day are the people that are trusted for delivery of service. We saw how effective it is with the vaccination programme, which has been managed by the NHS. We've seen how ineffective everything else is. I mean, let's not forget that some of the contracting firms who win contracts have gone bust. You know, we've seen building companies go bankrupt, having collected the money and leaving the work half done. The Royal Free Hospital in Liverpool, for instance, is a shell of a building. It's cost them hospital facilities, and they're never going to get that hospital or the money back. We've got to really start investing directly in the NHS, let the people in the NHS who are professionals manage that work, keep it in-house, stop paying money to shareholders.
It's absolute scandal what happened with that hospital in Liverpool, isn't it? Totally disgusting. So what I think we've got, I say it slightly tongue-in-cheek about our wish list for the NHS, but hearing from the people that know it best, I think that we have got all the answers, and these things are not beyond the realms of possibility. You know, if we were in control of government budgets right now, all of this stuff is entirely doable. It would increase health outcomes. It would secure the economy, frankly, as well. And long term, we would all be much, much better off in so many ways. So let me just round this up. We've got a 15% pay rise, which would secure safe staffing levels, ending outsourcing. We would get rid of these nonsensical, the appalling way that they've decided that they can just hand out contracts to their mates as well, and socialism. So if we've got socialism there in society, we're funding all key workers' jobs properly. You know, everybody has got access to a decent house, education, health, life expectancy would go up anyway, and we would ease the burden on the NHS. So if that isn't what we need to do, I don't know what is. I just want to say a massive thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. And I think in a nutshell, these are the arguments that we need to go out there and just keep repeating until we want it, not get sucked into these arguments of pitting worker against worker or accepting anything like the insulting pay rise that they've offered. And thank you for your time, and we'll keep up the campaigning. Cheers, guys.
Good work, Jen.
Everyone. Cheers. So I'm trying really hard to keep that short and sweet. So that was a bit shorter than I was going for, but I think it works better because people will watch it all the way through then. They'll get to the end. And especially if I'll advertise it that way too, I think it works slightly better. But thank you. Really, really strong arguments. It just makes all the difference because you know your stuff so well and you're both such great speakers. But I think it'll make it highly watchable. So thank you. Hopefully that will have some impact. The thing with Socialist Telly as well, we go for like different stuff, but it's going to a slightly different kind of audience to some of the other kind of like left-wing things. So some of the things that you'll be saying, they'll be going to people that won't have heard it before. I know it seems all like really, really obvious to us, but it is like different kind of audiences on Twitter and stuff that we get into. So thank you. Really appreciate that.
Cheers, Jen.
All right. Thank you.
Cheers, Jen. Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.